The subject of today's lecture is the CSA, the Confederate States of America, and the nation that the rebels tried to build in the first half of the 1860s. The argument of today's lecture is that because the CSA never achieved its independence, as a result, its national history was shaped by war. Behind this argument, however, is my suspicion that the argument over the causes of the Civil War taking place in American history today is as much shaped by current political considerations as it is by any fair evaluation of the past based on evidence. In other words, many people think that the CSA was a nation in line with their own desire for lower taxes and smaller or more local government. And the evidence simply does not support this claim. When you read the declaration of causes that accompanied the ordinances of secession of the state of Texas, you read the reasons Texans, white male Texans, seceded from the United States. In that document, there are references to Kansas and border issues. There is fear of abolitionists and their power in the federal government. But the historical actors who seceded had a tendency to boil all these issues down to slavery, and their belief that the Yankees were coming after an institution that they thought was written by God in nature. But the North had passed no law against slavery, had merely failed to extend the slave code across the nation, North and South, and even to all Western territories. The Northerners' abolition was partly a sympathy for the slave, sure, but it was also partly a fear of the slave power, the almost aristocratic power of slave owners, not only on their own estates, but also in the federal government, due to the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. And abolition was also partly a fear of African Americans. There is no reason to claim Northern moral superiority in 1860, even if you sympathize with the abolitionist cause. But for the South, the ordinances of secession were clear statements of what the individual Southern states wanted, or rather, what white men in the Southern states wanted. Even more than this, the ordinances of secession had to be broad enough to encompass the plain white folk, or yeoman farmers, who owned no slaves but who could vote, in order for secession to succeed. See what I did there? A little pun for you. From the secession documents you read, I invite you to draw your own conclusions about the motivations of the Southerners in seceding, and with them, the causes of the Civil War. The motivations of those who fired the first shots against the United States military, and of those who followed them out of the Union. I've said from the beginning that in this class I am telling a story and constructing an argument, and all my lectures have provided evidence in support of that argument, which is the following claim: that the Civil War was about slavery. Here's a brief clip from the cartoon The Simpsons to cheer us up about such an unfortunate conclusion. Apu, who runs Springfield's convenience store, seeks his citizenship.
Got it. All right, here's your last question. What was the cause of the Civil War?
Actually, there were numerous causes. Aside from the obvious schism between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, economic factors, both domestic and international, played a significant...
Yeah. Just say slavery.
Slavery it is, sir. Yes, I am a citizen!
So I hope you haven't been watching my lectures all these weeks and thinking that I am so reductionist as to tell you, just say slavery. It was a lot more complicated than that. And part of your job for your final exam is to capture that complexity. Whatever you argue, you must grapple with the evidence of what actually happened and work it into your argument. That's some of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to recap the political history I've been telling you. At a certain level, of course, this history of political parties and their policies can be used to support the belief, on the part of some Americans, that the Civil War was about Southern resistance to big federal government. Because there is a conflict in American history between big and small government. I have never denied this. Remember, the Federalists who wrote the Constitution, at least partly in order to establish a more powerful federal government with taxing power to pay off the debts the United States had accumulated in its fight for independence. It was believed by the Federalists who wrote the Constitution that only centralized power could unite a big, fractious nation. The first real challenge to the Federalist power was expressed in the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, elected in 1800, who was accused by his opponents of trying to pull down the federal government, and he was in the embrace of the devil as he did so, in this portrayal. The candidacy and presidency of Jefferson set the stage for the political history of the 19th century. The Federalists fell apart after Democratic dominance for a long time, and the Democrat-Republicans of the Jeffersonian presidency became the Democrats of Andrew Jackson, who increased the number of white men who could vote, while standing for the people, despite his own immense wealth. Small d democracy as a contrast to small r republicanism of the Founding Fathers' federalism. Founding Fathers' federalism. This more aristocratic view of how government should operate became the Whig Party after the Federalists fell apart, and the Whigs liked a strong central government that helped finance economic growth through tariffs and internal improvements, including canals and railways. The Whigs explode during the 1850s, falling apart into their constituencies of anti-immigrant know-nothings and abolitionist free soilers. In 1856, the new political party, the Big R Republicans, come to stand where the Whigs had done and where the Federalists had done before that. They had always represented big government and government support for economic growth and big business, pro-creditor and anti-debtor, for the banks and internal improvements. These are the Republicans. In 1860, they won the presidency with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Of course, it was more complex than this, but the association of the different regions or sections of the country with different political parties, and each section with its own economic structure and way of life, can be expressed in a single word: slavery. And this explanation for the coming of the Civil War continues into the nation that the South created, the CSA. Because the CSA was not a small government, anti-tax resistance movement. It had 11 states and had to control millions of acres while waging a war for independence from the United States. The CSA created and maintained a strong central government and taxed its people heavily. Waging the war made both these things necessary. A strong central state authority was necessary to maintain a constant war against the Union, eager to put the rebellion down. And so too was tax income needed to pay the costs of war, as the insurrectionary colonies had learned 50 years earlier. Just as during the American Revolution, the CSA tried to leave taxation in the hands of the individual states, and the results were disastrous. Individual state governments refused to tax, or refused to hand over the taxes it collected. Individual states provided men and supplies to the Confederate Army, but usually tried to keep them close to home, rather than letting the government decide where they were most needed. In order to pay for war, the CSA lodged first in Montgomery, Alabama, before moving to Richmond, Virginia, established a tariff on imported goods as its first order of business. On May 21st, 1861, the CSA imposed a tariff averaging 15 to 20% of the price on all imported goods. They were not anti-tax. Let's take a closer look. Instead of policy, let's look at the individual human experience of the CSA and the kind of government it was. Some years ago, I was doing research at Duke University and came across this box of letters and receipts from the Civil War kept by the Pendleton family. This is how historians figure out what happened. We looked at the documents that got left behind. Here's the folder of documents from 1861 to 1865, and here's a receipt for taxes the family paid to the CSA. People with property had always been taxed, especially at the local and state level, and here's a receipt for someone paying a tax to the sheriff of Cumberland County in Virginia for his land, slaves, and personal property. That's my thumb. And here's another year. You can see these people own land and pay taxes on their land, but they don't own any slaves or horses, or a coach, or clock, or watches. If you think filling out forms about your income to pay your taxes is intrusive, think for a minute about the government coming by your house to count your clocks and watches in order to tax them. These folks owe $1.73 in taxes just for owning land. And there was another kind of taxes paid too, called tax in kind. That means that you pay your taxes in kind rather than in cash. You pay them in the kind of materials that are being taxed. If you grow wheat and owe taxes on that, you pay your taxes in wheat. If you produce wool from sheep, you pay your tax on the wool you make in wool. This is a tax in kind, and it was a pretty easy way for governments in the South to tax farmers who just grew their own food and might not see much cash. Here you can see a notice in a CSA newspaper from 1863 that the tax collector will be at specific locations on specific days in order to collect the returns of all pork slaughtered in the past year. Most often, you'd just take your return, the tax you paid on your pigs or pork or wheat or whatever you grew, to the courthouse on a specific day, and the county would collect it there. These fields out front of the courthouses were specifically to collect taxes paid in kind. But as the Confederacy waged its war and retreated further from its shrinking borders, this sort of social structure broke down. The taxman could just show up at your house and take your stuff and write you a receipt. Here's one from the quartermaster, who took 2 pounds of salted pork as tax in kind on the crop of 1864. In this case, whoever is taking subsistence stores for the 6th Regiment of North Carolina Volunteers doesn't even have a formal receipt. He's just taking your bacon and flour and coffee and leaving and writing a note so you have proof. For whom? For what? There's a reason that the momentary unity of Southern society slipped away during wartime, and people's faith in the Confederate government did too. That's my thumb again. Now, I'm not trying to say that the Confederacy was evil just because of its chaotic and heavy taxation on its citizens. I just think these documents undermine any romantic belief that the South and the Confederacy was anti-tax, that it was a small government idea. Early tariffs, regular taxes, counting your clocks and your slaves, and taking your bacon, these are not the actions of a government that rebelled against the United States and left the Union in order to resist taxation. That's our fiction, our belief, born from our own time. The Confederates had their own beliefs. We know from this class, and from the Declaration of Causes, the primary source that you read, that they believed certain things about slavery that seem like romantic fiction to us today. They believed their slaves were happy, and that they benefited from slavery and the civilizing influence of the master's household. But the course of the war, and the things the CSA did in order to fight the war, undermined even their cherished beliefs, just as the tax receipts undermine our modern-day assumptions. So let me talk a little bit about the course of the war and how white Southerners' belief in happy slaves was destroyed by wartime experience. Let me talk about mobilization. There was a lot of early enthusiasm for the war for Southern independence. As states seceded, men signed up to fight, especially in the days after the CSA bombardment of the Union forces at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. In the secession excitement, men signed up to fight for Southern independence, but the eagerness rapidly fell away. By 1862, the CSA had to draft soldiers to fight. The Union did the same thing in 1863. So first there's mobilization, volunteers eager to fight, then conscription, when the government has to draft men to fight. But the biggest planters and the richest sons protested their conscription. We have to stay home and run the plantation. So the CSA created a policy called substitution. If you were drafted but didn't want to fight, and you had 20 slaves or more to justify that you were needed at home, then you could find a substitute. You got someone else to fight for you. Substitution meant finding a substitute soldier to take your place. For this reason, the war soon began to seem like a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. A fight to preserve and defend the institution of slavery, but the non-slave owners did the fighting in their place. This revealed the class differences within the society of white Southern males. We read about that in Stephanie McCurry's chapter, and after secession, during wartime, the conflict between whites became sharper. This was one of the things that made Southerners question the romantic ideal of happy Southern life, and you'll see it also led eventually to the recognition that slaves wanted freedom. They were not happy. Because fighting a war requires a lot of labor. It's not just soldiers. Here we see Confederate dead at Chancellorsville, but pay attention also to where their corpses lie. There's a stone wall and a trench, and all that would need building before they could even fight there. These white Southerners used slaves to do their work, as they had always done. They thought their slaves were happy, and they brought them to the war in order to do the work of supporting the army, digging the trenches and doing the wash. But when they got near the Union lines, the slaves usually ran away. They ran toward the Union, the Northern Army, and their freedom. And some Union generals turned them away. And some fulfilled the obligations of the Fugitive Slave Act from the Compromise of 1850. They took them back to their masters. They spent time and money and Union energy to return the slaves to their masters. This was one reason why the Northerners began to see the war as an effort to free the slaves, rather than just an effort to hold the Union together. The Northerners were sick of spending money on this, returning slaves to their masters, who were rebelling against the United States, by the way. So some Union generals began to treat the slaves as they would treat any enemy property. They were contraband. Just like if you got a pig from an enemy farm while you were foraging down there, so you'll take a slave who's run away and volunteer to do some work digging trenches if you just call him free. Here's a historic cartoon showing how the contraband helped the army, here carrying men from boat to shore. Why would an invading army give up this valuable property that had belonged to the enemy, that was there to help? Imagine what this did to the Confederate Army. Its slaves were running to enemy lines. Clearly they had not been happy. And by the end of the war, by the end of 1864 and the beginning of 1865, the CSA was making promises to the slaves of the South to free them if they would just fight for the South. By the end, the CSA promised emancipation in exchange for work. This idea struck at the very heart of the Southern pro-slavery ideology and appealed to the slaves' desire for freedom. So, mobilization, conscription, substitution, and emancipation were all tied together. The problem of manpower to fight a war for independence required abandoning the ideology that they were fighting to uphold. This was a bitter lesson for Confederate rebels. Before the war, the white Southerners had also believed they were superior to the North. Farming was better than factories, and that they were independent and self-sufficient because they had farms. They thought an agricultural society can never starve. But this was a fantasy. The South grew cotton more than it grew food, and it grew cotton to sell in the world market. It had basically a colonial economy that grew raw materials to export, to be manufactured elsewhere. It grew cotton for the cotton mills of the Industrial Revolution in England. And it depended on the outside world for its economy to survive. At first, the CSA plan was to starve the world of its cotton, and thereby force the diplomatic recognition of its independence. If England needed Southern cotton, it would support Confederate independence. But England just found new sources of supply. Here's a cartoon from a British newspaper that shows the Americans fighting in the doorway, and here's an Englishman, the classic John Bull, saying, "If you two like fighting better than business, I shall deal at the other shop." The other shop is India. The Brits went to India to buy cotton and stimulated its production there. Here you can see Indian cotton exports grew in the 1860s and kept growing after the war was over, threatening American cotton growers forevermore. Of course, the product of India and its marketing system was not as sophisticated as that of the Americas, but the British effort to find cotton elsewhere stimulated its growth all around the world. Not just India, but also Egypt and Brazil. Over the years of the American Civil War, new places grew more and more cotton to meet the demand. The CSA was shooting itself in the foot by seeking its independence. Here we see the theme of ideals versus economics play out. The economic reality was that Southern cotton was replaceable. If they were fighting for economic reasons, the right to their own economies, against the tariff, and against industry, and for the continued expansion of cotton plantations, their own customers did not support their efforts. Their ideals, or ideology, the pro-slavery belief that slaves were happy and the institution was the basis of their society and culture, is the better explanation for the war. By the time the Confederacy tried to resume selling its cotton, it was unable to do so, because in order to get the cotton out, it had to ship it out. It had to control its coastline and protect those shipments. And the Confederacy had 3,500 miles of coastline to defend. By 1862, less than a year after secession, the Union had successfully sealed off the ports of the South. This was called the Anaconda Plan, named after a big snake, and it was the brilliant plan of General Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican War, to blockade the ports of the Confederacy and cut it off from commerce with the rest of the world. With harbors blocked off, the CSA couldn't sell its cotton and had no leverage with foreign governments to force recognition of its independent nationhood. Without cotton to sell, without commerce, the CSA faced the same problems the USA had faced as it fought for its independence. It printed money to buy what it needed, to buy your winter's supply of bacon from your farm, and the result was rapid and massive inflation. Here's what it costs to buy gold with Confederate money over the course of the war. It costs more and more, especially after 1863, to buy a chunk of gold. And not just gold. Anything you wanted to buy would require more and more money every year. Here's an index of prices of things in the Confederacy during the war. It's as if a six-pack of beer that cost $10 today cost $15 tomorrow and $20 the day after that. Money lost value as the cost of goods rose. Economics conflicting with ideals. Is it any wonder that loyalty faded as the war dragged on? The ideal was not living up to the reality. The slaves sought freedom, and the plan to free them for their military service had to recognize that freedom is what they wanted. They weren't happy as slaves. The government taxed, sometimes taking your goods right from your farm, and the tariff kept import prices high. And they couldn't export their cotton, and they weren't growing much food. And planters could stay home while poor men fought. Southern loyalty to the CSA government in Richmond fell away, making the war harder to fight, independence impossible to achieve. I'll talk next time about fighting the war and how it mirrored and shaped the home front experience of fading loyalty and losing hope within the Confederacy.